So, a bar of iron only costs $5. When it's made into horseshoes, it's worth $12. When it's made into needles, it's worth about $3,500. When it's made into the balance springs for fine watches, it's worth about $300,000. See, all of us have a value, and I think part of the problem is sometimes we focus on our value by just what we have or what we look at others to be. And I really believe in 2019, God wants us to step out, and we need to understand is that we all have that $300,000 value, but we spend all of our time focusing on the $5 purchase price. See, I really believe that going into 2019, God wants us to be unstoppable and unmovable in what He wants to do in us and through us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
See, it's one thing to say it makes sense, but it's another thing to walk out the door and when somebody says something or somebody does something that you move back to the $5 value you put on yourself. You know, you're only worth what you let yourself be worth. I can tell you, as we've been shopping for houses, there's people that have houses that are worth a lot less than what they're asking. A whole lot less. I mean, we were looking at one house, and they were so overpriced. But the fact was, in 1972, they built the house, they raised all their children at the house, and now all their children have brought back their grandchildren to the house for years, and now they're too old to take care of the house, but they also haven't changed anything in the house since about 81 or 82, but they still have the value. Why? Because they have that sentimental value, but they really are not putting value back into the house. Does that make sense? But there's other people that have houses, like right here in Lafayette. I saw a house, and it was a bargain price. It was a really bargain price at $625,000. And I was thinking, wow, I got to look at this house. And it's right up there in Old Town Lafayette. It was all of 900 square feet. It had a little tiny bathroom with a little tiny stand-up shower. It had one little sink that was about this wide. It had granite countertops. It had the original hardwood floors from 1921 that have all been redone. It had 2 bedrooms and the 1 bathroom. The fence in the backyard was falling apart. It doesn't have a garage, and it has a little tiny front yard with an old white picket fence that was probably built in the 50s or 60s. It sold in 3 days. See, the value is what somebody wants to pay for something. The value is what somebody wants to put into something. And you know what? If somebody could turn around and take that house and they could sell it for the $100,000, I think when it was new, it probably sold for a couple $1,000s at best. But see, the reality is, it's what you put into it. It's what you make out of it. And the same thing happens with us. You know, I trust that the message today is going to bless you, and it's going to teach you the importance of lining up your priorities with God's priorities. Not just any of God's priorities, but God's specific priorities for you and for your life. That it would just line up so that you can understand what your purpose is, and so that you could be that 1921 $600,000 home. Does that make sense? See, I don't claim to know it all. I know that I'm very far from perfect, but I've learned a lot of things walking with God. I've learned a lot of things along the trail. I've learned a lot of things from other people. I probably learned more from my mistakes and my failures and my stumblings and my scraped knees than I have from all the books and all the teachings and all the classings I've sat in. See, I've learned that there's a God, and the existence of God does not negate the existence of an enemy that's against God's plan in our lives. I've learned that, you know what? the enemy is not red and have a little fork tail and a little pitchfork and run around. You know, the enemy, so many times we give him so much credit. But we're giving him credit to things he hasn't even done. We actually give him credit for things that we've done to destroy our own life, and we blame it on the enemy. And we give him all the credit, and we do all the work. Not only do we do all the work, we conjure up the whole plan, and we execute the plan, and then we give him full credit for doing it. In 2019, I'm telling you, that has to stop. If you want to move into God's purpose, you have to stop giving the enemy fodder. You have to stop buying into the enemy's plan. See, in the garden, he told Eve, but didn't God say? And then she just kept adding on to it. Didn't God say you shouldn't eat? Oh, we shouldn't even touch it. Well, where did he say that? See, he just gave her a millimeter and she took it a mile. And I'm not negating, Adam was standing right there, so Adam took it the same mile. They were walking hand in hand, so don't go down that path. But the fact is that we take little things and we blow them up into these huge things, and we literally build the house and then we live in it. Another thing I've learned is God birthed us for a reason. And that reason is that he has a divine purpose for each and every person's life. I don't want you to think that you have to be something spectacular. You have to be on staff at a church, or you have to be a leader in a church, or you have to be doing certain things for God to use you in your divine purpose. Because you can have a divine purpose in your job. You can have a divine purpose in your family. You can have a divine purpose in your school, in your neighborhood. You can have divine purpose, can be executed anywhere, but the fact is you need to be in the center of God's will if you want to see that divine purpose roll out. Another thing I've learned is humans as a whole have an innate desire to win in life, to succeed. And the only way to do that, at least in God's eyes, is to discover, to develop, and to deploy the purpose God has for you. See, we always want to win compared to everybody around us. But God wants us to win according to what he has for us. See, it doesn't matter if we're trying to run everybody else's race. Because you know what? We can't win their game and we're not in their game. God has us in a lane. God has a purpose for each and every one of our lives. And we need to start stepping out and walking into that purpose. Another thing is, pursuing purpose and doing God's work does not excuse us from challenges. In fact, it usually attracts more opposition. See, the enemy doesn't care if you come to church. He doesn't care if you put money in the offering. He doesn't care if you're doing good things. He doesn't care if you pray every day. He cares if you're making an impact outside of the circle of yourself. See, he's actually quite happy when you're just content and you just sit. Why? Because you're not making an impact. You're not advancing the kingdom, so the enemy could really care less. Does that make sense? See, what the enemy doesn't like is when you start stepping into your purpose, then opposition comes. Why do you think the enemy tried to kill Stephen in the book of Acts? He tried to kill Stephen. Why? Because Stephen was out doing the plan and the purpose for God, even up until his very last breath when he's saying, God, forgive them, because they don't even know what they're doing. See, he was in the center of his purpose, and I got to tell you, it wasn't all prosperous, it wasn't all glorious. Everybody around didn't say, wow, I want to be just like Stephen. But I'll tell you, there were people that were, I bet you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that were against Stephen. But the minute he was being stoned, and they heard him crying out to God for the forgiveness, I guarantee you there were people there in that crowd that their hearts were changed. I guarantee you that out of all the Romans that were there when they were nailing Jesus to the cross, And he's saying, you know what, you're not going to take my life, I'm going to lay it down for you. You know what, it had to change their hearts, because those people on that detail had done this hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of times, and now all of a sudden here's somebody, it had to just change them in a different way. And it didn't change them by screaming at him, it didn't change them by preaching at him, it changed them by he knew he was doing the Father's purpose. And even in the midst of all that, see, he was at perfect peace. See, there's always going to be opposition when we're doing those things. Another thing is, a human who is committed to becoming a conduit for the divine, unstoppable, is unstoppable because the power that comes from God will freely flow through a submitted and surrendered vessel. See, if you're fully submitted, if you're fully surrendered, it's just going to naturally come out of you. You don't have to work it up. You don't have to make it happen. You don't have to conjure it up. You don't have to understand. I'm not saying understanding is a bad thing, but I'm saying is if we have to understand something before we do it, then we're never going to do it right in the first place. God is a supernatural God. He does supernatural things. And through those supernatural things that we can't understand, that we can't copy, that we can't replicate, that we can't put down, this is how it works. It's through those things that change comes. It's through those things that His purpose is played out, both in our lives and in the world. It's through those things that we're bringing His kingdom here to earth. So with that in mind today, I want to give you a few examples of just regular little old me's, just humans who surrendered to God and became unstoppable. The real question is, what does it mean to you today? I mean, that's what we really need to focus on. So, number one is, Joseph was unstoppable. Joseph had 10 ruthless brothers. He was married to a high priest's daughter. He spent many years in prison, but none of that could stop Joseph. After 20 years, his dream came to pass, and he told his brothers that God had taken away what they planned for evil, and He had turned it into good. How many of us, the minute we get a word, we want to run out the door and see it happen? I mean, let's be real. And then, if it doesn't happen sometimes within a day, a week, those out there that have really great fortitude, if it doesn't happen in the first month, then what do? We start complaining, we start murmuring, we start grumbling, we get mad at God, we get mad at everybody else. Didn't you hear what that prophet said? You guys need to recognize me as whatever. Just because God speaks something over you doesn't mean it's going to happen at that moment. It took 20 years from when Joseph had the dream to when it came to pass. And along those 20 years, he had to learn a lot of lessons. See, I think sometimes we need to understand, if we want to walk into greatness, that we need to understand what it's like. I mean, I said this a couple months ago, but if you really think about it, people who win the lottery, I think they said something like 85 or 90% of them are bankrupt within 2 years. And some of them have won hundreds, $500 million, and they're bankrupt. Now, I just want you to stop and think about that. You know, there's a lot of people that are some of the richest people in the world that are worth like 50 million or 70 million. And here's somebody that instantly went from 0 to 500 million and then they're bankrupt. Why? Because, see, they got too much responsibility all at once and they didn't know how to handle it. Where somebody who's earned all that money, they've learned a thing or two in life. See, I believe that God doesn't just give us stuff just that easy, because if He just gave us stuff, then we would go out and we would make a fool of ourselves. But more importantly is we'd make a fool out of Him. When you go back and you start tying all the little threads in the scripture together, that's why he says, you know, that if you're faithful in the little, I'm going to give you more. Why? Because if you're not faithful in the little, you're never going to be faithful in the much. If you're not faithful with treating people right, he's never going to put you in a leadership position. Why? Because it just gets grander and grander, and the impact goes deeper and greater, and when you make a mistake, it goes deeper. And the reverberations go on. The next person we're going to talk about is David, because David was unstoppable. An angry king with a cold-blooded army couldn't stop David. Time after time, Saul attempted to kill David, but God protected him for his purpose. After 13 years, God's word spoken to him through the prophet Samuel came to pass, and David became king. Just look at David's life. Just look at who David was. David had already been anointed king by the highest prophet in the land. It wasn't even just spoken. He was anointed with oil. The whole ceremony was done. As far as the big scheme of things were, at that moment, he was king. And what happened to David? One of the greatest things that happened in that whole time here on earth, one of the greatest things that God had done was anoint David king. David wasn't even recognized by his own father, you know. It has to be one of these. Well, no, yeah, another kid. I know all these kids are great, and I know they're all great, and they all have their own things, but God isn't telling me it's one of these. You must have another child. Go get David out from the sheep field. When he came out, he was anointed, and what happened? He went right back to the sheep. He went right back to being a delivery boy for his brothers, taking them their lunch. I really want you to understand is, when he was anointed king, just think about when we inaugurate a president. Just think about when they set kings in place. It's a great monumental thing, and today people around the world celebrate it. That's what really happened to David, and it took 13 years. And during that 13 years, the very man that God replaced him with attempted to kill him over and over and over and over. And even when David had a chance to put a stop to it, he knew that God's purpose was still in full place, but it wasn't yet time. Do you recognize the time that you are in? Do you recognize the season you are in? Do you recognize the place God has you in? Or are you trying to do it on your own? It's the real question. It's the real thing that we battle with within ourselves. Gideon was unstoppable. 125,000 soldiers could not stop Gideon. And Gideon only had 300. It wasn't a fair fight because God was on Gideon's side. See, you plus God equals victory every single solitary time. God even caused the enemy to turn on themselves and kill each other. Why? Because Gideon was doing exactly what God told him to do, exactly the way God called him to do it. I want you to think about what Jesus said. He said, I only do what I hear the Father tell me to do. Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. See, it isn't about following a leader, it's about following him. And in that following of him, you are following leaders. And you need to know that your destiny isn't in what the leader does. Your destiny is doing what God has called you to do. See, David had a leader who wanted to kill him. But he still never stopped following. He still never stopped serving. He had a spear thrown at him. an X amount of time, whether that was a day later, a week later, a month later, it doesn't exactly tell us. He was back in the king's presence again, serving the king. Now we can look at that and we can say, oh yeah, that's good, but let me tell you this. If you're under a leader and that leader comes against you, how many of you just throw up our hands and say, I'm having nothing to do with that, I'm going to move on over here? I mean, let's put it in the biblical perspective is, see, David didn't care what David was doing. I mean, David didn't care what Saul was doing. What David cared about was the purpose that God had called him to do. And he knew that God's purpose was greater than anything Saul could ever do to him. See, Gideon knew it was crazy to only take 300 and go against an army of 125,000. But he also knew that it was crazier to try and raise up 200,000 to go against the 125,000, because that would mean for sure that he was going to lose. Why? Because it's not the way God told him how to do it. Paul. Paul was unstoppable. He was flogged, he was stoned, he was shipwrecked, he was in prison. Nothing could stop Paul. Paul's whole attitude was, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. See, Paul had the right attitude. Paul had that biblical attitude. Sometimes we say we always want to be like these people. You know what? Paul just went out and did it. And he didn't care what people said. He didn't care what people thought. He didn't care if they supported him or if they didn't support him. Because when they were supporting him, they were supporting Christ. And when they were rejecting him, they were rejecting Christ. And so Paul didn't take any of it personal. Paul just kept doing what Paul was doing. See, we got to look at the other side is, Paul wasn't just doing great things. He was doing what God called him to do, and he was doing it with an attitude of, it really doesn't matter what other people think, what other people say, what other people understand. I know what I know. And then he's writing to the church at Rome, I really long to come to you. I'm praying for you daily. I want to do this. I want to do this. But God hadn't opened up that door for him. And so what did he say? It doesn't matter what my desires are. It doesn't matter what my wants are. It doesn't even matter what's burning within me. You can't say that there wasn't something rolling within him. You just don't pray for somebody every single day and not want to go be a part of what's going on there. But he understood the difference between the yearnings within his heart and the calling that God had on his life. See, it's like the enemy was saying, okay, Paul, well, if you say to live is Christ, then we're going to kill you. And that's okay, because for me to die is gain, is what Paul said. And then the enemy said to him, okay, Paul, in that case, we're not going to kill you. But we're just not going to let you live in peace. Paul said that's okay too, because I reckon that suffering of the present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed within us. See, Paul was saying, it doesn't really matter. If you let me live, I'm going to serve the Lord. If I die, I'm going to be with the Lord. So it's a win-win situation for me. There's nothing you can do that's going to hinder me, that's going to thwart me, that's going to make me move off the path you have for me. He said, if I serve the Lord, I'm going to make out okay. If you kill me, I'm going to go straight to heaven. If you make me suffer, I'm going to have a bigger crown and a bigger mansion in heaven. The bottom line is, there's nothing you're going to be able to do that's going to stop me or take me off the track of what you have. Do we really have that heart? I mean, we have the desire to be that person, but do we really have that heart? Do we really have the fortitude to walk that out? Or do we have, it's all about me syndrome? See, Jesus was unstoppable. Satan couldn't stop Jesus. Bible tells us that if the princes of this world have known what they were doing, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. They thought when they killed Jesus, checkmate, they won the game. But actually, they were just lulled into, they backed themselves into a corner where they didn't kill themselves, but they put themselves in a stalemate where they couldn't move then to the left, to the right, to the front, to the back. They were caught in that one place on the chessboard where they couldn't go anywhere without dying. When the first drop of blood hit the ground, they'd already sealed their fate. There was no going back. All those people that I just talked about, they're all unstoppable. Every single one of them was unstoppable. Every single one of them, when you read through, with the exception of Jesus, stumbled at times. They fell at times. They didn't rise up to the occasion at times. They had doubts at times. They didn't always do 100% the right things. But the fact is that even when they went off track, they immediately got back. Even when they fell down, they stood back up. Even when they got scuffed up, they didn't deter them from moving forward. See, the reality is, each and every one of you, you're unstoppable. See, if Satan knew any better, he would just leave you alone. But the fact is, he knows that you're unstoppable. If you think things are rough, you got to understand you're unstoppable. And the thing isn't focusing on what's going wrong, focusing on what's not happening, focusing on timelines, focusing on those things. The thing is focusing on what does God have for you to learn in this season, and how are you going to go from point A to point B? How are you going to stay in the center of His divine will? See, Satan can't stop God's purpose. See, Satan can't stop a man or woman who is walking in God's divine purpose. You have to understand that. If you're being stopped, I got to tell you, it's because you got off the path. If you're being stopped, if you're being hindered, it's because you're no longer on the path that God had for you. You have stopped, and now you're doing your own thing in some way, some shape, or some fashion. That's why he wants to get you frustrated. See, when you get frustrated with what's going on, when you start focusing on all the little things, when you start focusing on other people, what do? You get mad and you quit. When you get mad and you quit and you get discouraged, and what happens? You stop walking in God's divine purpose, and you end up being a gun with no bullets. Being a poison that doesn't kill anything. You end up being a light that can't even open up darkness. You end up being totally ineffective. See, that's all he wants. See, Satan can't stop you, but you can stop yourself. See, when you quit, then you've already stopped. When you get frustrated, you've already stopped. When you start focusing on everybody else, you've already stopped. When you start focusing on, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Well, what are you supposed to be doing? That's the real question. What are you supposed to be doing? Why are you where you're at? What is your divine purpose? That's really the question. If you need to feel led, go down to the tire store. They have a whole bucket there right next to the tire thing, and you can feel led. It isn't about feeling led. It's about understanding God's purpose. It's understanding and finding out who you are and staying in your lane and doing what you're called to be. Nisha isn't here today, but I was joking with her because at the reading house, when we were there last Sunday, every Christmas they do a huge puzzle. There's some of those crazy people that it's like 3,000 pieces or something like that, and they're all little tiny. And they'd been working on it since Christmas, and there was still a lot of it left to be done. And I was joking around with Nisha, and I said, "Hey Nisha, there's a piece here on the floor. I think I'll put it in my pocket, and then I'll just come back when the whole puzzle's done because I want to be the one that finishes the piece." The bad part is they have a Roomba that runs around, so there's a good chance that they're already missing a piece. But I thought, now, when she's missing a piece, she's going to come and blame me. But the whole point of that is that each and every one of us are a very specific piece, and it cannot be replaced. And when we try and be another piece, when we try and be an edge piece, and we're really not an edge piece, we're a center piece. When we try and be a top piece, and we're really a bottom piece, and it has nothing to do about location, is you were created to be a piece in the kingdom of God. And not only are you a piece, the reality is when the puzzle's finished, it's never finished till all the pieces are in. And no piece is insignificant, even if that piece has absolutely nothing on it. Why? Because the puzzle will never be finished without that piece. And so even though when you look at it, you might go, this is an insignificant piece, when you get to the last, if that's the last piece, and has no part of the picture on it, it's just a solid color, it is the most important piece at that moment in time. And I got to tell you is, you need to keep that in your mind. You need to keep that idea in your mind because you are an important piece. You just don't recognize your own importance. My message to you today is, never give up. Never quit. Never give in. It's to move forward from where you are into all He has for you. Quit focusing on what's going on around you and start focusing on what God has for you. I mean, we have so many great things coming up. I got to tell you is, I've learned over time, it's great to go places, it's great to go to conferences, it's great to learn these wonderful things. But you know what? If you go to conferences, if you read books, if you're listening to podcasts, if you're doing whatever you're doing, if you're doing those things but you never apply it, then it's absolutely worthless. It's worthless. So you have another thing. Then you move on to the next thing, and you move on to the next thing, and you move on to the next thing. I want to let you know, God is always moving. God is always doing something.